We have a little break in the weather. We were here on July the 6th, commemorating the 137th anniversary of the Battle of Homestead, the 1892 Battle of Homestead. My name's John Hare. I'm the president of the board of the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Welcome to the pump house. How many people have not been inside the pump house until tonight? Wow, okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming. This is sacred ground to us. It's the only building remaining of the original Carnegie steel from back in the 1870s that started. And this is the very site where the battle occurred. The pump house was occupied by strikers and townspeople defending against barges that had been brought up the river from Beaver County. There were two barges and one tug pulling 300 paid Pinkerton detectives. And of course, it was early morning. The Union and the townspeople had a great early warning system. As soon as the barges were seen in Pittsburgh, the word was sent to Homestead. And it's estimated that 6,000 to 10,000 people, townspeople, including the workers, turned out to repel the detectives, who were, some of them, college students looking for work, that were put in a barge in Beaver County and handed a Winchester and told, follow this sergeant who had been in the Civil War or something. And it all happened here. Most of you, I believe, know the story. I'm not going to go into detail about the battle, except that the detectives were repelled. They were abandoned by their supervisor, who was one of the first ones who was shot when the gunfire broke out. And they finally surrendered, and were the Union negotiated a ceasefire and an early exit for the Pinkerton detectives, and they were sent up the banks of the river and accompanied by a raging local town group who were giving them a lot of reasons why they should never come back. And they were ultimately put on trains and sent back to Beaver County. The afternoon left at least 7 townspeople and workers and 2 or 3 known Pinkerton people who have died, and a number of other people injured. And we celebrate this not because it was a symptomatic violent effort of workers exercising their rights to their jobs, but we celebrate it because of the spirit of the town, and because they weren't just striking and they just didn't lose a strike. What happened is that they faced impossible odds. Prior to the expiration of the contract that was in effect, that Carnegie had negotiated with the Union 3 years prior to the expiration of that contract, Carnegie had Frick build a wall around the entire mill, a wooden wall 12 foot high around the entire mill with barbed wire on the top, and they electrified it, one of the first uses of electrifying for lights around the mill, and locked them out when the contract expired. And the only workers permitted to come in were ones that said they would abandon the Union and accept fixed contract bargaining terms for wage cuts and for forsaking the union. So that was one of the issues. The other issue is that while the townspeople and the workers were victorious that day in repelling the Pinkertons, whose job was to permit non-union workers to come and work. We have a name for them. What do we call non-union workers coming into work during the strike? Yes, yes. What happened was, in about 3 weeks, the industrialists who had strong influence in the state government persuaded Governor Robert Patterson to send in 7,000 militia. It was the entire state militia. And they occupied these hills above in Homestead. And while the workers in the union had some hopes that their fellow workers in the state National Guard might be sympathetic to their cause, they were required to follow orders, which was to maintain order, which meant they would protect any scabs that wanted to come in and prohibit any of the union strike activities to occur around the gates of the mill. So we want to commemorate this day and think about its significance to today and tomorrow. And there's no better way to do that, we believe, than telling stories that aren't usually told, to engage people who may have themselves been involved in similar activities or have relatives and stories passed down from their families. And we want to create those stories as new information informing what the people were thinking and doing, as opposed to what the owners were doing, and developing news and perspective about why events happened as they did. Because the Homestead strike did not result in the employees in the union having an agreement and a real voice at work, it really set a tone for labor relations throughout the United States, which essentially was at-will employment, and at the will of the owner, you will work, and you will work under the wages and conditions under which the employer decides. And of course, it wasn't until the mid-1930s and 40s that the conditions which worsened much more after the strike. Most people, I think, have read about how the shifts were expanded after the strike, and workers were required to work 7 days a week, and on the 7th day, they would rotate their shift and work another 7. And they were working often 10 to 12-hour days. We are proud of the heritage of the area here. We're proud that Homestead and the workers eventually, after unionization, were able to try to build a middle-class life. We're proud that from this mill, at its height in World War II, had perhaps 15,000 people working here and producing plate steel that was useful for the Navy, and rails and other solid steel used in construction. We're proud of that. So tonight we want to talk about, let me just quickly read to you our mission, our values, our vision. I'm proud of these statements, and I'm proud to see Karen Bryant here tonight. Karen, who helped and led us 5 years ago on a
Welcome home,
we had a strategizing session where we talked and tried to clarify what we wanted to do, what we believed, and how we thought we could do it, and to try to set some goals. We developed this mission. We are inspired by the dramatic labor conflict of the 1892 Battle of Homestead. We promote a people's history to empower today's workforce and build strategies for the future of work. Our vision: we will celebrate working class culture, preserve labor's rich heritage, and shape the future of work. And our values: the dignity of work, labor's rich heritage and its pivotal place in society, community engagement through programs and partnerships, skills developments, and a prepared workforce for the future, human rights within a robust democracy. Our vision is that we can see that our area has a richness in labor history, and it's our thoughts that the message that surrounds our labor history trail is one that people are eager to hear and is useful for them in building their lives and the future that we're facing for our economy and our country today. And we feel that a vehicle that we call a Center for the History of Labor and the Future of Work is our goal to engage the public, young people and others looking for work in dialogue to face the very serious and real problems we face as a country for our future coming up. And what can we learn from the past, and what can we build for the future? So that involves ultimately a center, a building, a place, and we have been inspired so much by our guests tonight. 5 years ago, our member Chris Marks and Mary Dennison, his wife, drove us down to Matewan, and we had a small bus. It's quite 7 hours, Shaun, from here to Pittsburgh, and we've learned a lot from the tremendous work that the miners, the members of the enthusiasts who have built the Mine Wars Museum in Matewan have. And we're so pleased that they're coming to us and they're talking about how they're building that museum and how it's outreached, and they've reached new levels this year for programming, and they've moved into a new building. They've worked together with the still functioning United Mine Workers Local in Matewan, and they've developed, most impressively, I think, education programs focusing on the building of unions. So I'm really anxious to hear Shaun and Mackenzie tonight, and I'm not going to read their autobiographies because I don't know them, but I do know that Shaun is a wonderful curator and artist, and has a tremendous history in terms of using his skills for the people. And Kenzie's a top-notch organizer, because we've seen what's developed from over the last 3 years, maybe, that she's been working as a chief organizer for the Mine Workers Museum. So that's enough about us, and let me hand it over to Shaun to talk about it.
All right.
To see some familiar faces and a lot of new faces in this room. So my name is Mackenzie New-Walker, and I work as the Executive Director director of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. I have been there almost 6 years. November will make 6 years. I started working at the museum just a couple months out of undergrad. I was a history and political science major, and I actually did my history thesis on the rhetoric of the Maitland Massacre. And I got to learn about this cool People's History Museum down in Maitland that just opened a couple of years ago, and started following. And I saw that they were hiring a director, and I did not go to school for public history, but I was like, this looks pretty cool to do for a couple of years. And then 6 years later, I'm still with the organization, and it has grown leaps and bounds. I got interested in this history really through my dad and growing up listening to stories. So the mine wars weren't something that people are typically introduced to through a textbook, but instead stories that were shared around kitchen tables and on front porches. So I am the daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of United Mine Workers. And I'm super proud of it. I feel like I get to carry on their legacy through this work. And it's also a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, my name.
Oh, sorry.
Can you? Am I?
Yeah.
Okay. I muted it because I sounded like we were getting some feedback, so I didn't want to. I think we're okay. So my background is as an artist. I went to art school partially because I was a terrible student in public schools, and I didn't think I could make it in a regular university. That's one story I tell. And so I studied art, and while I was in college, I was also involved in a lot of anti-war activism and working with people who were living on the streets in Nashville, Tennessee, where I was going to school. And I got interested in people's history, I think originally just because I was trying to figure out how we got to where we were. I was curious. I had never paid attention to history classes in school. I didn't grow up in a union family or anything. And in Tennessee, I feel like there was not a lot of sense of the history of industry in the landscape. When I moved to Pittsburgh, we had dinner with Chris and Mary, and I was saying, you know, it's when I moved to Pittsburgh about 20 years ago that it crystallized that people's history was important to me, and I really started reading about it. And so thanks to a lot of people in this room, really, and finding buildings like this and places like this where it had been preserved was really what kicked it off for me. And I got involved in the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. It's a longer story than this, but basically in 2011, I went down to a really big protest march that was for 5 days in the southern West Virginia coal fields, marching a path that we'll get into later to Blair Mountain. And it was crazy, and it was very hot. And I did this march, and you know, it kind of was melding environmental movement that was against mountaintop removal, strip mining, and trying to link that to current day organized labor. And a couple of years after that, one of my friends who had been an organizer said, you know, we're organizing a museum down in Mingo County in Maitland, and maybe you should come check it out. Maybe you'd want to be involved. And I think she knew I would just dive in as a workaholic and just continue to plug myself into this thing for years after. But that's how I got involved. And I also want to say, we can do some Q&A afterwards, but I also think it's more fun if people just raise their hand as we're going, and then it can be a little bit more organic. So as we go through our slides, if there's something you guys want clarification on, or you just want to ask us about, just raise your hand and we'll just get to talking about it.
Yes.
If that's cool with you guys. So.
I'm going to kick us off and talk a little bit about where we are in the world. So we're located in southern West Virginia in a small town called Maitland. Maitland, according to the last census, has like 400 residents that live there. And so we're in a very tiny rural community. Maitland, back in the day, during this period, was an independent town. So it was not a company town. It was not under company rule, but instead it had its own elected officials. It had its own police officers. We didn't see, Baldwin Felts detectives, similar to the Pinkertons, roaming around the streets. This is what Maitland looks like today. This is what our downtown historic district looks like. When you come into Maitland, a lot of it looks like it did back in 1920. So it looks like a postcard, I think, when you come in town. here is our local union hall, UMWA Local 1440, which we work really closely with. We always have a member of 1440 on our board, and they're just really active in the community. Now, this is a retired local union, so there's not anyone that is like actively working underground anymore. So it's a lot of retirees that work there. And Matewan is famous for a shootout that happened there. I'm sure I don't have to tell people in this room about a 1987 film that was directed by John Sells and produced by Mackenzie that really, put the town on the map for the first time since the 1920s. It wasn't really talked about, at least on a national scale or for a national audience. People weren't necessarily coming into Matewan to see where this shootout happened. And I think largely that's because people didn't know about it, and that includes the people that grew up there. It was a history that, had been just not talked about very publicly. And there's a couple of reasons for that we can get into later. But our museum sits right across from the site that this happened. So John, you were talking about this place and, really having a place-based history. The same is true for us. We're just right across the street, and we always direct people to go check out the bullet holes that are still lodged in the back of the building.
Our first, is it this one or this one? Our first museum was in this building, I think.
Yeah.
One of these two.
Yeah.
Which is where, yeah.
And then we moved across the street. And I'm going to let Shaun talk.
Yeah, right. So basically, coal mining is central to what we do. And I didn't grow up in a coal mining family, so I had to learn a lot about it through this process. I think the first year I got involved, I read about a dozen books about the mine wars to sort of catch myself up on this history. But we'll get into this more later, but one of the things that we talk a lot about is the mixture of race and ethnicity in the southern West Virginia coal fields at the time of the mine wars period, which when we talk about the mine wars is roughly 1900 to 1921. 1921 is the Battle of Blair Mountain that summer. So we're talking about a 20-year period of various events that kind of lead up to this huge war in the Appalachian forest. But we talk a lot about, I think there's a lot of kind of work that we do against stereotypes and against like the idea that Central Appalachia is, just a bunch of white hillbillies and whatnot. And one of the ways that we do that is by talking about the original mixture of people who lived and worked in the coal fields at that time. And like Kenzie said, I've worked in a lot of different museums, mostly art museums. They're never integrally working with labor unions. I think it's just like not a thing that happens. And we are since day one. It was one of the things that I thought was really incredible about going to some of the first meetings that I went to, that I was actually sitting there. Here I was like kind of the local parlance would be tree hugger. I was a tree hugger sitting in these meetings with these guys who had actually mined coal underground. And that's amazing. And like Kenzie said, we still work with the local, which is pretty huge. They've actually sort of embraced a lot of other regional locals to just continue to build a power base and to actually purchase property, which we'll get into in a minute. I'm not going to try to encapsulate everything about the mine wars, but you can pick in if you want to. I think this is a period of time when it was incredibly dangerous to try to unionize. So one of the things that continued to happen to people in Matewan and in these other company-owned coal towns is that if they got involved in unions, you're living in company-owned housing, right? And so you work for a coal mine, that coal mine company owns the house that you live in as well as the store that you shop at. And the store that you shop at only takes the money that you're paid in, which is issued by the company that you work for. So it's an entirely closed system, right? And when people would get involved in unions, often the company would kick them out of their company-owned housing and they would end up in these tent colonies. So that's a big thing that we'll kind of touch on a few other times tonight, but I just wanted to kind of throw up some pictures. Sometimes people live in these canvas tents for well over a year through the winter in these difficult conditions.
These conditions that Shaun's talking about, if you decided to join a union, not only were you jobless, you were also now houseless. And these company towns were patrolled by Commonwealth's detective agents. These were mine guards. So this is a very similar business practice, I guess, as the Pinkertons. These were not good people, you know, to put it plainly. And a lot of these company towns experienced a lot of violence. And ultimately, these conditions over decades of efforts to unionize led to the Battle of Blair Mountain, which was the largest farm labor uprising in the history of this country. This is when 10,000 miners who were black, white, and immigrant banded together, and they tied red handkerchiefs, red bandanas around their persons in order to identify themselves. They didn't have standard uniforms. The going uniform at this time was either their World War I uniform. A lot of these miners were veterans, and they were, from stories that we've read, they were pretty patriotic people. And blue jean overalls plus this red bandana to determine which side you were on. And so here's some pictures that we have, and here's an original bandana which was recently loaned to the museum by Ed Harless. His great-grandfather brought an original down. This is like the holy grail of the museum now because we've been searching for one for years. We only knew of one that existed, which was located in the State Museum up in Charleston. And we came into contact with this person, Ed, through Air Monuments Project, which we'll talk about, and build a relationship with him over the course of a couple of years. And we finally got him down to the museum, and he brought this bandana, and he said, "Do y'all have any use for this?" And I was like, "Yeah, I think we would." So we're really excited about this. But here's some pictures from the battlefield as well. And some newspaper headlines. The key players at this time were the Redneck Army, so these miners, and these were really organized people. They had passcodes to keep out spies, one of which was icon creeping. And journalists, they didn't want journalists in. And you also had King Cole's army. So this was an army that was led by a local sheriff in Logan County, which is just one county over from where our museum is located. And his army wore white armbands, and he employed a lot of deputies. He also employed just people off the street. And we also had the U.S. Army that eventually came into play. This was, Battle of Blair Mountain is the second time that the U.S. Army was going to drop bombs on its own citizens. The first time had been 3 months prior during the Tulsa Race Massacre out in Oklahoma. The U.S. Army didn't actually end up dropping bombs. There was a crazy storm that happened. Miners would say it was divine intervention. And they turned around. However, Don Chapin and his private army did end up dropping some pipe bombs. We have some replicas in the museum from that.
I usually show this slide just to highlight the fact that this was national news at the time. So when we talk about these stories being buried, it wasn't like they were buried at the time. I mean, this is the New York Times. There were journalists coming from all over the country to cover this, and then it wasn't. Then several decades went by where it was just completely kept out of textbooks and history books and whatnot. A lot of historians didn't even know about it. So we opened in 2015 in this small storefront, which is, half the size of this room that we're sitting in, maybe? At best, yeah. Big undertaking at the time. I couldn't believe. I guess I wrote about this recently. I kind of didn't think we were going to last that long because I didn't know. I thought internally we had an incredible group of people. You know, I got involved, and everybody, all the details were covered except the part about when somebody walked into the museum itself, like what they would experience, and that was the part I ended up doing. And I thought, we're going to do all this work, and the coal companies are going to shut us down because this is sort of how things go down here. There was a precursor center to ours in the town of Blair that didn't last very long. There had been other efforts over the years to commemorate this history that just didn't have any lasting power. So I thought maybe we'd be in the store. I was really nervous. I mean, some of y'all, I actually came to one of the Eaton Park meetings years ago when we were actually still in this building when I gave that talk. And I remember at the time saying, yeah, I lose a lot of sleep at night thinking about us getting kicked out of this building that we were in. It didn't happen. We were in that building until around the time Kenzie got hired, about 6 years ago. It was in 2018.
Yeah, I had been working at the museum for just a couple of months, and the local union invited me to a meeting. They were like, I think y'all should move over into this new building we bought. And I was like, man, I just got this job. What? We're about to move? And yeah.
And then so we had, these are just a couple of photos of the original inside of the museum, which was, I mean, just everything was just really compressed. Now that I think about it, we were just trying to cram so much history in there, but it also really never been done before, so we were just really proud of it, right? And when the union bought this building, their idea was that we would be their anchor tenant, basically, because they saw us after several years as being like the only organization in town that was actually truly preserving the history of the union, but also just people's history generally. And they saw it as an investment in the town and the county and the region to convince us to move in there, which partially involved convincing me to come back and redesign the entire thing, which we did. So I call myself the creative director, which is a title I made up. But what actually happened in terms of designing this thing is I worked with our entire board. We had a very active board, and we had several design meetings where I basically we talked about everything that we'd done in the original building. We talked about mistakes, pros and cons, whatnot. What could we do with this new space? Not a lot of people get that opportunity. We expanded threefold, right? Like the new space is 3 times bigger than the original storefront. And this is kind of an aerial perspective of the walls when I first painted them. And I'll get into why it looks like that in a minute, but basically my personal challenge was no right angles, and then I handed out layouts of the building to everybody in the board, and they just drew with markers what they thought the museum should look like, and we talked about it, and then that's actually how it came together. So when I say I'm the creative director, it's not all coming out of my skull. I'm doing a lot of translating and metabolizing of a larger group collective effort at this, memorizing this history. But and it was also a bank, by the way. Like we just literally had to rip the entire bank out. So all of this plywood on the floor, a lot of that we had to put in. The walls were framing, just literally everything that you see we had to build from a bank that had closed like 2 months before we moved in. Something like that.
Yeah, and I'll say too, this is one of the newer buildings in town, which means it's 75 years old. But it had undergone several renovations by the time we got in there, and yeah, it's still, when we moved in, it still very much looked like a bank. We had to break up some teller desks and lay down plywood, and a lot of this building, it was Shaun's labor, but also there was a ton of volunteer labor too. I mean, we didn't hire contractors to come in and build these walls. We actually found a volunteer organization that we still work very closely with, Coalfield Development, who came in and said, we'll put the walls up, and then we had to figure out how we're going to drywall this. And so we organized volunteers that knew how to drywall. It was very much a collective effort just to get this back up off the ground.
A lot of retired coal miners that just love to build shit too. It's just like really chomping at the bit to put something together.
Yeah.
I'm happy to answer questions about the exhibits, but I'm just going to kind of go through them quickly. It's essentially chronological the way that you go through our museum. So when you first walk in, you go through an area called Life in the Coal Camps, which basically just establishes what the situation was for most workers in 1900. And that's where we have, there's a lot of coal mining museums in Appalachia. This is like our kind of just basic, like here's coal mining and coal mining town life. That's what this section is. And then you move through the early part of the mine wars, which there's a particular set of events in 1912 and 13 called the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes. And that was, in some books, that's the first mine war. We have this tent that my partner Becca built, who's also here tonight, and it was really nice to give it some space, right? Because if you saw it in the earlier slides, it was which was like crammed into a corner, and so now we have some space for the tent that you can get inside. These slides aren't chronological, but the Battle of Blair Mountain is divided into the three parts, the three sort of groups that we're fighting, with a lot of artifacts and archaeological finds, which I will talk about. One of our board members' great-grandfather, Frank Keeney, was a key UMWA organizer during the mine wars, and he was actually also one of the founders of the museum. So we have like some of this great-grandfather's stuff in a case. You know, there's a lot of these amazing connections that we've actually been able to develop over time to bring in the objects themselves. Which, as an artist, I'm really into just the things, the old things, and you know, maybe antique shopping with my mom a lot as I was growing up also got me into that kind of stuff. But so now I'm kind of in heaven with getting to handle this stuff and show it to people. So I can just kind of click through. That's actually a piece of a jail cell from where some miners were held after the Battle of Blair Mountain that was brought to us 2 weeks before we opened. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that happens to us, like things. What's that?
Who's that guy?
John Lewis, who was the president of the United Mine Workers for an incredibly long period of time, 40 years. Yeah, that painting was given to us. I believe it had been stolen from someone's office at the United Mine Workers. I don't know, there's some crazy provenance behind that.
I've also heard that every West Virginian had 3 portraits in their home. It was John L. Lewis, Jesus Christ, and JFK. Everyone had a picture of them. So that's some lore that, you know, is just passed on.
And I really didn't want to like tour you guys through every single detail because I thought that would put you to sleep, but I did want to show you this is a brand new exhibit. We have one window. Well, there were a lot of windows in the museum before we covered most of them up so that I could control the lighting and make it dark and moody. But we left one open where when you're standing in front of that window, you're actually looking out the museum and across the street to where the shootout originally happened at the Battle of Munhall in 1920. So, like I said earlier, our original building had actually been where some people were standing in the back doorway and shooting, which was really cool, but that wasn't part of our exhibition. But this was something where we had the opportunity to develop, and it took me a couple of years to get around to it, to develop an exhibit where you, looking out the window, could kind of place yourself in that moment. And we actually got Chris Cooper, the guy that plays like sort of the main character in the movie Make One, to read a narrative that one of our founders wrote. And so you go and you press buttons and there's a map, you can look at where you're standing, you can listen to Chris Cooper read this narrative. I just did that in May. So, as I was saying to you earlier, we're always improving. So if you haven't been to the museum yet, come soon, but if you can't come till next year, it'll probably be a little bit better because I might have done new stuff by then. So.
Yeah. So the museum has question, yes?
Yeah, the museum is open, what time of the year?
We are open the last weekend of March through the last weekend of November, and then we transition to what I consider our educational season. And just recently, we opened 5 days a week. So when we first started this, we were open on Saturdays and Sundays, I think, and now we're open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So we're right there. We have almost the same hours as our state museum in Charleston, which is pretty cool. So Make One, town of 400 people. We had 2,000 visitors come through the doors last year who physically walked in. 40% of those were students of all ages. So I'm talking from kindergarten all the way up to college level classes. We do a lot of outreach to schools and programs. Sometimes they do some inreach to us and said, "Hey, we heard about your museum. We want to come down." We've had some pretty crazy tours come through our doors, but you know, we oftentimes have board members who will give a presentation and walk people through. These are people who have lived in that community for decades and decades and have lived through a lot of union history and can relate a lot of, you know, personal stories. The museum, I say recently, but it's been almost 2 years ago, we hired an education coordinator who's sole job is to do this sort of outreach with students.
You know, I just thought it was the state police tour.
Yeah, that was one of those tours.
That was one of the weirdest ones. We had a group of state police cadets come through in their full uniforms. And the state police in West Virginia were formed during the mine wars as a response to Union activity. So
Yeah.
these guys all came, I think it was all guys, came
Yeah.
in their hats, their chin straps, and everything, and
We
toured
did,
the museum. I mean, they were into it, I guess.
yeah, Chuck did a special tour that was just like focused on the formation of the state police, and they wanted to get to that and the ugly. So, archaeology. So a lot of our stuff, one thing that people always ask is like, how do you get all this stuff? Where'd it come from? And it's really a hodgepodge. So from very early on, one of the largest loaners is a guy by the name of Kenny King, who's pictured up here with his metal detector. He lives very close to Blair Mountain in a small town called Bethel. And he has been up on the mountain for decades, digging up stuff from Blair Mountain. Do you want to speak to what it's like to work with him?
Yeah, I think he's been going up there since the early 1990s. And I'm thinking that date because I think he guided the first ever official archaeological survey of the Blair Mountain battlefield, which was done by a group at WVU in I think like 1994. Which is crazy, right? It's like almost 100 years later that somebody finally went up there. And the coal companies used to say, you know, well, nothing really happened up here. There's not a lot of evidence. There's not a lot of buildings. Like it was just a skirmish. There were some drunk people with rifles and whatnot. Kenny, who has worked, he recently retired, which I'm really happy for him because he was working constantly. He's also, when he wasn't working, he was on the mountain with his metal detector mapping out the battlefield. In the battlefield, when I talk about battlefield, it's a 13-mile long ridge line. So Blair Mountain is the southernmost part of Spruce Fork Ridge, and the whole battle happened along this whole ridge line, which kind of divides, it's the beginning of Logan County. We can get real deep in the weeds if you guys want to know.
So how many people died in the Battle of Blair Mountain?
How many? We don't really know because there weren't a lot of records kept, and a lot of them on the miners' side, they would just pull people off the mountain and take them home. I mean, there was a lot of secrecy. There was a lot of, there weren't very many people recording this kind of stuff. On the defender's side, I'm actually not sure. They probably had better records.
Yeah, I mean, there's some estimates that we've seen, but we can't be sure. That range from like 10 to 100. And it was pretty secretive especially from the miner side. There's a couple reasons for that. One is these guys are being tried for treason, and so you're not going to talk about that publicly. So that's a very clear indication of how this got hidden. The second reason is just plain censorship. There's actually an exhibit that Shaun built inside the museum. Some of my textbooks that I used for my thesis showed, hey, here's a history that has not been talked about in public schools, or here's where it should be.
There'd be like a paragraph, and that would be it.
Or nothing.
So part of Kenny's work was just doing this memory work kind of on his own, acquiring these objects, digging them up out of the ground, and even when digging is kind of a.
I might have missed it, but I think it's important for people to know 7,000 to 10,000 miners took up arms. Did you say that?
Yeah.
It was a huge number of people who took up arms.
7,000 to 10,000 miners. I've heard upwards of 15,000 even, and I think the vigilante force and the state police and whatnot was about 8,000 maximum, right? Maybe not even that many. So the unionist coal miners outnumbered the defensive line quite a bit, but then they were also outgunned, which we can talk about a bit more, but I saw you had your hand up too.
Are there any stories of police and military who abandoned their leaders and joined the miners or supported the miners in some way?
I haven't heard any, but I kind of wish. The Battle of Matewan that happened the year prior to the Battle of Blair Mountain actually does involve the town's chief of police, Sid Hatfield, who was on the side of the miners, and he actually was responsible for the ambush that became the Battle of Blair Mountain attacking the Baldwin Felts people who had come to evict families from their homes. I see another hand up there. What's up, Kevin?
So while you're talking about this, maybe this is a good time for people to learn why the red bandana. Because differentiating between the police and the minors and the language stuff. There's several people here who did the 100-year anniversary Battle of Homestead, and that's where we learned about it. And that's Karen's wearing one of those bandanas from here, but it's Would you mind? Is that okay?
Kenzie alluded to it a minute ago, but basically what was happening during the battle is that nobody had a uniform, right? I mean, I assume the state police did actually, but you have basically two irregular armies clashing in the middle of the woods. And so, like Kenzie was saying, some people just showed up in their overalls, some showed up in their World War I Army uniforms, and the only way they could tell each other apart in the woods when they were fighting was the Unionists had a red bandana and the defenders had a white armband. And I think also the defenders are usually the guys with machine guns up on the ridgeline. That would be another way to say it. So before the U.S. Army came in, this was, and I don't know the entire history of the red bandana as a symbol of unionism prior to that, but it definitely since then has continued to be a symbol of solidarity, and we really sort of toot that horn now. I mean, it's one of the births of the term redneck. It certainly was in the news at that time. That redneck was a negative stereotype word that was used. They had the red bandanas around their necks at the time. So, one more question, and then I'm getting way in the weeds here. So I want to keep going.
Who currently owns Blair Mountain, and is there anything being done for preservation or access to that site?
I'll leave that to you.
That's a great question. So Blair Mountain itself, and even, so there's a town up Blair too, that was a coal company town. A lot of it is owned by out-of-state landowners and land companies that are connected to the coal industry, and so it's still very much privately owned. The museum has a project where, a lot of people when they come in their doors, they're like, how do I get to Blair Mountain? They want to make that pilgrimage to go there. And I tell them, if you blink, you're going to miss it because there's not much there. We're going to talk about that. The museum's work, one day we will have a monument at Blair Mountain and some markers and places for people to come and visit, which we should wait and get into that a little bit later. We've got a couple of slides that we want to show you.
It's hard to overstate how much influence the coal companies have and how much of the land is actually privatized. So a lot of it has actually been strip mined already, not the entire mountain, but a lot of it. And then the reason we've had difficulty operating in the town of Blair, if you were to drive there today, it doesn't look like much is going on. Like Kenzie said, a lot of it's actually owned and privatized and inaccessible to us. Owned by people who wouldn't want to work with us. Just to say about Kenny's work, I think and to your point, actually, one thing I think is interesting is that a lot of Kenny's preservation work, pulling these objects out of the ground, involves trespass. So one of the ways in which our collection has grown has been through Kenny walking through private coal company-owned lands and finding these pieces of ammunition and other metal things that have survived in the leaf litter over 100 years and collecting them and bringing them to us. Well, he didn't bring it to us at first, but he collected it at his house and doing the mapping on his own. So this is one of the few firearms that's actually been found on the battlefield. It's an old Winchester 1873 that had been almost entirely rotted out. The wooden stock is gone. It was loaded when it was found. A lot of miners stashed their guns when they retreated after the battle. They were going to come back and get them later. I guess most of them were picked up, basically a display case of a bunch of ammunition that Kenny has found. And I think, I'm not a gun guy, but I've learned a lot about firearms through this work. And one of the things that I think is interesting just to point out to anyone is that on the Unionist coal miners' side, the type of ammunition is just this broad spectrum of everything from little 22s, somebody's squirrel shooter, to really, really large caliber long-range rifles, and even some stuff from machine guns that were seized. On the other side that was against the Unionist miners is all this military-grade 30 caliber stuff, the Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun, brand new toy at the time. Kenny has found these basically like a tree trunk with 30 to 50 empty 45 caliber shells at the bottom of it from where someone just unloaded an entire drum from a Tommy gun at a bunch of miners in the woods. That's the kind of stuff we're finding. So what they were up against was an incredible armory of stuff, and they just brought whatever they had at home. And I know I'm doing a lot of the talking here. I keep looking at this. I also became our de facto collections manager. So I'm not trained as an archivist, but it got to a point after we rebuilt the museum where we said, like, now we've got so much stuff that's not even on exhibit. We have to figure out how to also catalog and index that stuff and begin to use that stuff for storytelling as well, because there's so much of it. The building's only so big. So we started photographing everything that came into our trust. And by this point, people had started to bring us family heirlooms and things as well, too. I was kind of naive. I thought that would happen as soon as we opened, but we really had to build trust over several years. So we developed a online catalog, and now I do the photographing and the indexing of all of the objects. And what I call the other museum is in the back room in our artifacts room, where we had this huge amount of stuff, not just Kenny's archaeological finds, but stuff from actual archaeological surveys. And then, like, we just processed the collection of Dr. Fred Barkey, who passed away a couple of years ago, who was an amazing Appalachian historian and donated a bunch of his work to us. So we've cataloged that. This is company script that when I referenced earlier how you would be paid in money that the company made, basically. This is what it looked like. There was a paper version. Most of the paper stuff hasn't survived as much, but the coins are these kind of weird coins that look like somebody just made them up. Sometimes they're made from extremely cheap material, sometimes pressed fiber even. We have a huge collection of that stuff. And that's online too. I think we have one of the biggest collections of script online that you can browse. I think it's about 130 pieces now. And we've broadened out from just Mine Wars stuff. So it became apparent to us pretty early on that the way that people approached our museum was as a kind of broader memory institution than just the 21 years that we consider to be the Mine Wars. So people would bring us their grandpa's coal mining helmet, or just other things that they had that they felt like we had become an institution that should be the place where these things live, even if they were only 30 years old or it had been theirs. You know, we have a whole bunch of Union stickers from the 1980s and 1990s that there really wouldn't be a home for otherwise. And we can skip that, that's just a catalog thing, but I was going to say we put most of our stuff online in these online exhibits. Chris Marr wrote the intro essay to this particular one, which is our entire collection of mine lighting and lamps, right? So, you know, this is just, I mean, as an artist, I always kind of like online exhibits are kind of boring because, you know, you really want to see the thing in person. But for us, we have, I think, nearly 900 objects at this point that are in storage that are mostly parsed out into these online exhibits. But this is like the best way we can sort of provide this stuff for free to the public. I'm going to hand this because I'm talking too much.
No, you're fine. No, this is great. I think I just want to underscore free because a lot of universities and larger research institutions, oftentimes you have to pay a fee, or you have to pay to get a scan, or you have to pay to get there. You know, we realize, I think the museum's rural location in Maitland, it's not easy to get to for the folks that talk about our trip. We're not a pop off the interstate. If you come to Maitland, you're going to spend the day in Maitland and hang out because you drove all this way. And so I think the museum's very location has always argued for like a very robust and large online presence. And one of the ways that we do this is through our digital archive. So people can do this for free online. And also we curate it into online exhibits that people of all ages can do. We get contacted a lot by student researchers from the 3rd grade to senior thesis who are interested in doing their school project about the Mine Wars, and they need stuff, they need primary sources in order to do them. This is their solidarity gallery. This is a new this was a new addition from the museum's move. So we moved across the street in fall of 2019. We had plans to open in spring of 2020, but that didn't happen. And so we opened a little bit later that year, Labor Day of 2020, and we opened with a new gallery. This is like an art space. So it's something that we change every year. So it changes annually. And this was one of the very first exhibitions that we put on. We've had artists, we've had history exhibits, we've had student work that's been displayed. So it's really a broad range that we cover. Here's our most recent, The Children of Mother Jones. This is the 5th anniversary of the West Virginia teacher strikes that happened. And we saw all 55 counties in West Virginia go out on strike, and then that really rippled across the country. I can remember loads of reporters coming to the museum that year, and they were like, would people be surprised that this strike, started in Mingo County or came out of West Virginia? And I was like, the people who know the mine wars wouldn't be surprised. And so we put out a call, and we had teachers who either donated or loaned stuff, and we talked about the 5th anniversary of the strike. So we had a lot of union t-shirts, we had some signs. There's 2 screens that are put up because one thing that was interesting about the teacher strikes is the role that social media play. And I think the role that social media plays in organizing in general, there were a lot of fun stuff that came out of that. So we've got some rotating screens that
It's like all Facebook memes, basically.
yeah, that share stuff.
And I would just say too about Solidarity Gallery, I mean, it was always kind of I don't know, I felt like we were always kind of busting at the seams with ideas. And when you build a history museum, in many ways it's kind of static, or it's hard for you to see the whole thing as a piece in these slides, right? But it was like, once it's there, and you can kind of like move around a little bit within it, but we really just needed a space to play and a space to bring artists in to reinterpret it. And that ended up being like the right pressure release valve for us to, this is a tiny room, it probably doesn't look big in this thing, it's very small, but it's packed with stuff.
I touched briefly on education. Oh, is there a question? I touched briefly on education earlier about students coming into the museum. We also have this growing teachers resources list that's available on our website. So if you know a teacher, send them to wvminewars.org/education. One thing that we have always done from the get-go are lesson plans. Education and preservation are like really at the core of the museum's mission. And so we focus a lot on 8th grade history because that's when West Virginia students learn their state history. And so we've got a slew of lesson plans and primary resources and background information for teachers to use. One thing that we just rolled out this year is over here on the left is something called Teaching Trunks, which is super exciting. These launched in January, and the idea behind this was similar to the reason why we built a digital archive, is because not everyone is going to get the chance to come to make one and see the Mine Works Museum, even if they really want to. And so we built what I consider a museum in a box, and we put artifacts that we purchased on eBay that are specific to the time period. So we have script, we have old coal camp lights, or old coal mining lights, we have dinner buckets, we also have photographs of teachers that have magnets on it so teachers can put it right up on their whiteboard when they talk about it. We have a curated lesson plan, we have maps, we have movies and DVDs. Basically, you could spend a month on a unit of the Mine Wars if you wanted to. And we have 3, we started out with 3. One is what was like in the coal camps, and it talks about above ground and below ground. We also have one that focuses on solidarity and diversity. So Shaun was talking about the workforce of coal miners, West Virginia. I think a lot of people now, when they think of West Virginia, they think of it as a predominantly white state, and that's true. But it wasn't always. And so we talk about the way in which people were actually recruited from the Deep South and from Ellis Island to come and live this American dream in the West Virginia coal camps, and they found something totally different and how they found solidarity through their differences. And we also had a trunk that's called Mine Wars History. Most women were not coal miners, but they definitely did not play a bystanding role in the mine wars. Some women, when we were talking about the numbers of the Battle of Blair Mountain, I've seen estimates as high as 20,000 when you think about the nurses that were involved, or the people who fed the miners, and the people who supported the miners and housed the miners, all these different roles that people played beyond just grabbing a gun and participating in battle. So we have like a nurse's uniform and talk about their role there. We have profiles of different union leaders. So launched in January, it has reached, I think, close to 450 students so far from all ages. It's been a couple of different places. It slowed down a little bit through the summer because of summer break, but we expect it to pick back up this fall. There's always something to do. We launched a new program last October. It hasn't even been a year ago, which is pretty crazy to believe, but this program is called Camp Solidarity, and it is a labor organizing program where the thought behind this actually was born out of the Blair Centennial. Right after it, I'll talk a little bit about that soon. But the idea was we should get people to make one. This is like ground zero for where the American labor movement was born. A lot of these labor organizing conferences happen in Disney World and in Vegas. And so we were like, what would it look like? Would people come to make one? So I think this was very much an experiment of like, could this happen? Will it work? Where are we gonna have people sleep? You know, lodging is a challenge. There are so many challenges with this project, but it worked. Here's many of our attendees from Camp Solidarity, and we put on a 3-day labor training conference in the Southern coal fields, and we made makeshift broadband for the whole town so people could have access to Wi-Fi and call home. But most importantly, we engaged people in labor history in a place where, you know, Sid Hatfield and Mother Jones had walked the streets. So they got to check out the museum, they got to tour Maitland, and we also brought in organizing experts, people who really are movers and shakers of the American labor movement. And this was not just focused on Appalachia. We had about 120 participants come that included speakers and panelists. I think there were 33 states represented that came to this conference and 17 different organizations. So from labor unions like the United Steelworkers to some of the new labor unions that we're seeing, like tenants unions, and the Kentucky People's Union was well represented. So it was just a really cool experiment that we said we should do this again and make this a regular part of our programming. It's one thing that I think we've always been interested in, and I heard John, you speak to this, it's like we don't want the mine wars to just be this thing in the past that people talk about, but instead we really want to engage with how can people use this history today. I don't think about the museum as an organizing space, so to speak, but I definitely think we're an incubator for organizing. Yeah.
Did people actually go to work for unions after this? Do you know about? Were there organizing directors from some of the international unions that were looking for people to help?
My sense is that everybody who came was already involved in some level of organizing. This is from the first project, so I got to kind of be in the background a bit, so I'm not totally sure, but yeah, everybody was kind of involved in some way or another. We had a lot of firefighters.
Yeah.
There was a ton of firefighters.
Yeah, and it was definitely marketed to, like, if you're in a union right now, you should come here. So it was like for rank and file members who were already actively organizing. I think from this, though, the conference and the purpose of the conference is going to grow and shift over time. It was our first year doing it, and I think it went really well. We decided to do it again. We actually just had a planning call today to talk about next year.
It's 3
days?
3 days,
And
yeah.
where did they stay?
In the parking lot of the.
No, I mean, some people did camp. There was camping available. There's also, Maywood is situated in a place where there's a lot of ATV trails happening. So there's a lot of Airbnbs and cabins that are popping up. And there's a resort right down the road from the museum that really caters to that market. So we called them ahead of time and said, hey, can you reserve some cabins for this purpose? So everybody did have a place to stay. So it worked out.
You have catering
We had catering. We even had vegan and vegetarian options too.
Which is a rarity in Maywood, believe me.
Yeah. So we were able to pull that off. Yes.
Have you had any notable international visitors to Maywood?
Notable international visitors.
You might not have known.
Yeah.
I'm not.
I mean, we've had some international reporters come through, but I don't know, it's hard to tell who walks. We definitely have people from other countries come to the museum, but...
Only because you asked that, can I not remember it? You know, if
Yeah.
I was trying to come up, but I'm trying to think, I mean, like John Sayles and Maggie Renzi have come a couple times, the people who made the film made one. I think sometimes people just come in and they just want to see it and not say anything, so...
We're going to just come from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, but we're going to tell you, we're here from Johnstown.
Yeah.
Or tell us you're famous. And
Yeah, we'll believe it.
Say,
Yeah.
you mentioned the film, and I saw the film when it first came out, and I cannot find it anywhere. Do you know where it
We
is?
sell
We
it.
have it in our gift shop. If you
We'll
go
sell you a DVD of it. Yeah, it's remarkably difficult to find. It's not streaming online.
I
but
was streaming, it wasn't, it didn't come up anywhere. It was way before streaming, and I started looking for it.
we sell the DVD now. The Criterion Collection
Okay.
made a remastered version of it several years ago, and we probably more copies of that probably get sold out of our museum than anywhere else in the country. I can't imagine who else is selling it. But we sell that, and we sell Harlan County, USA, which is also.
Do you draw many visitors to the ATV trails?
It's about half and half, I'd say. You know, we have a check-in system that helps us track that. We made some modifications so we can really get down on the numbers to see who's coming. But yeah, we get a lot of people that walk in and they're like, now what is this place again? You know, what's the story? So we get to introduce this to people, which I think is a great thing. You know, if they've never heard about it, they don't know much about coal mining. I think a lot of people know about West Virginia and coal and something about the Industrial Revolution, but fewer people know about, you know, this incredible labor movement that happened and isn't really well marked. So yeah, we get a lot of trail riders.
I like to brag that I think we're one of the only museums in the country that has 2 boot scrapers at the entrance because they get real dirty. We have 2 boot brushes for you.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming to Pittsburgh, Allegheny County Homestead. We appreciate it. Again, this is a subject that should be taught, just like the Wagner Act, Taft-Hartley High School. So kids know this is America. This is what it took to get in our workplace safe working conditions. Couldn't help but notice on your headlines from the New York Times, the sub-headline, miners reportedly bombed by plane.
Yeah.
I was a student at Kent State, okay? We had unarmed kids that we scared the National Guard. All right, we know that. They were murdered and 9 were made. When you start to block, is it Baldwin fellows? Is it the government that bomb working people, women and children? Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, the U.S. Army was positioned to bomb U.S. citizens at that time. They brought in 2 kinds of airplanes, and one was the old Martin bomber. And I always just like to remind people, this is in the era of biplanes, so these are incredibly loud wooden engines that a lot of people in the mountains have probably never seen one flying around, and they were circling around during the battle. They did not end up, the U.S. Army brought those in. The Army, the government, did not do the actual bombing, although they were positioned to. The bombs actually ended up being dropped from private airplanes, like homemade pipe bombs and gas bombs that were dropped from these smaller biplanes, these little Jennies that you could purchase after World War I. Like sometimes mailmen operated them and whatnot. So there were bombs dropped, and like Kenzie said, this was just a few months after the Tulsa massacre, where the same thing happened with napalm in the Greenwood district of Tulsa. So in terms of the race relations that we dig into in the exhibits, there were a lot of black miners working there, right? And there was a lot of racism against them. And I tend to think that the defensive line, Don Chafin and these other characters who were against the Union were well aware of what had just happened in Tulsa and thought, you know what, like, that's what we're going to do here in the mountains as well. But it is important to note that the U.S. Army, there was a guy named General Billy Mitchell who was really into aerial bombing. Aerial bombing was a new thing at the time. And he said, we could just do that here too, right? Like, it works. It worked on this battleship. It might work in the mountains. So.
Yeah.
Well, we got a lot to go. Oh, sorry.
One more.
Charlie.
There, the same year, within 6 months or 4 months before, was Tulsa and the burning of that whole neighborhood. And the bombs were used at that. They actually preceded this. I always thought this was the first bombing from an airplane of Americans, but actually it happened at Tulsa. But that was a corporate plane, I believe, with dropped dynamite.
Really?
Where this was not a government, what I was trying to make sure.
Well, Don Chafin was the sheriff, so he was local government. He was local government, but it was not the U.S. Army. That was the only distinction.
And the other issue, I go every year up to the Adirondacks. I've been 5 of the last 6 years at John Brown's Graveyard Farm. And last year I met with their whole board, and I told them about the Battle of Blair Mountain and the Battle of Homestead. It seems that there should be some sort of natural connection to the kind of organizations that we have. In the Lion Mountain Mining and Railroad Museum, which is on the lake where my ancestors come from, the purest iron ore in America, they made all the cables for the Golden Gate and the Brooklyn Bridge were all made out of this iron because it was absolutely the purest in the country. What's extraordinary about that place, I think a lesson for all of us, is that their mine, Republic Steel Mine, shut down in 1969. There's nothing around there except one prison about 30 miles away in terms of employment. It certainly looked at those who knew the area well that town was doomed. They had this historic, this mining and railroad museum in the old railroad station. And it's an extraordinary place, and they put so much work in it. 30 or 40 ethnic groups were in this town. About 80 people died over the course of the years of mining that iron. And this historical museum saved this town. It kept the spirit and the memory alive, and the children have all come back. You're up there now, they're putting new siding on the houses. It's from 1969, I mean, they had nothing. I mean, they were really scraping. It was old people kept alive the memory of what they were as a community, and the young people have gradually come back and are rebuilding the whole area. And I think this power of history is really extraordinary, and I salute you guys. You guys are wonderful.
I've certainly seen Macon change since I've been there. I don't think we're the only change agent in town, but I've definitely seen some other kinds of investments that have happened in the town. And I'd like to think some of it's just because we're also bringing people in there. I mean, I don't know. You can speak to it better than me because you grew up around here. But
Yeah, I think that's true.
You want to talk about the centennial?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your internal organization and how you mount fundraising campaigns and that sort of stuff?
I can talk about that all night.
What if we do that at the end?
Can we say that at the end? We'll come back to that and remind me. I want to talk about the Battle of Blair Mountain Centennial, the 100-year anniversary, and I was on the core planning team. This is actually how I got hired at the museum. The museum got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was a challenge grant, which meant, we're going to give you $60,000 as long as you raise $60,000. And that was over the course of 3 years. And so they were able to hire a part-time director, which ended up being me. So I started out as part-time, and I was the museum's first salary position. Also on the core planning team is Ms. Karen Bryant, who did a lot of work with us in establishing the mission, the vision, the values. What is this thing going to look like? And helped really usher us into, what the Centennial became. So thank you so much, Karen. You did great work. This was 3 years in the making, so it was very much an organizing project where the museum, oftentimes never does anything alone. We always like to build partnerships and bring people in, so we use this as an opportunity to really create a network across the state of West Virginia and also across the region. We have Battle of Homestead very well recognized at this event. And this culminated, it was 3 years of planning and lots of Zoom calls and lots of phone calls and lots of in-person meetings. And it culminated Labor Day weekend of 2021. And it was the state's largest event series that took place geographically. So we had stuff all the way up from Morgantown down to McDowell County. There were exhibits, there were walking tours, we had concerts, we had reenactors, we had church service, we had all kinds of stuff. And it was all led by community partners that stepped in and said, this is really important to recognize. We even got a proclamation from the governor of West Virginia at the time, which was great, but yeah.
So I'm gonna pick up. So it's already 8:30. Sorry about that. So we'll pick up the pace a little bit because I know some people are probably going to get antsy, but I know there's going to be more questions because internal organization is also really interesting to me. So I want to make sure we address that. Maybe we could have a plenary after for people who want to talk about that. But we alluded to this earlier. There's not much at Blair Mountain. And in fact, there's only one state-sanctioned historical marker at the base of Blair Mountain, which you could just cruise right by. That's it, right? Everybody knows sort of the format. There's one out here. That's all that there's been for quite a long time. And one of the things that happened during the Centennial is that people said all the time to us, like, there's nothing on the landscape. Like, you have this museum in Matewan, that's awesome, but to get to Blair Mountain in 1921, miners marched 50 miles from a town called Marmet, which is, it's a little blurry, but down south of Charleston, all the way down to the ridgeline that they ended up fighting at. So there's an entire 50-mile area that people conceived of as being a place of memory itself. There's all these towns and whatnot all the way through there. We got involved in a project through an organization called Monument Lab. 2022. I've lost track of times. We've done so much in the last few years.
It was just a couple months after the Centennial.
Couple months after Centennial, we won a grant through an organization called Monument Lab. And we were part of a cohort of 10 organizations around North America. There were a couple indigenous organizations. There was a group of archivists in Puerto Rico. We were suddenly in a kind of national cohort bringing Appalachian history to all these people who didn't know about it and learning from them. And so our job was to build monuments on the landscape through this grant pretty quickly. There was about a 10-month turnaround or something. It was wild. And so, as Kenzie said, we don't do this kind of stuff alone. We do this stuff collaboratively. So our idea, given the time frame, we couldn't cover the entire 50 miles, so we bookended it. We went to the community of Marmet, and we went to the community of Clothier. Marmet is where the march started. Clothier is pretty close to Blair. It's not Blair, but it's close. And we started having community meetings. And these are basically, we just showed up and advertised that we're going to have a meeting, and I gave a presentation about what is a monument. And I showed them all kinds of basic monuments and then some really weird stuff. And then we just asked people, what do you want to see? I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever been in a meeting where people said, how would you design a monument for your community? But most people don't get asked that question. So we asked, and then we kept coming back every month. And I remember saying, like, the people who are really going to be into this are the people who actually come to the second meeting and start to trust us through that process. So we kept taking notes, and over the course of like 6 months or so, I think we built out, trying to think of all the details. We basically tried to come up with a process that would involve the community as well as involve our budget, which was actually quite small given what we were trying to do. And we ended up, I don't remember quite how this happened, but I remember that we boiled down to that the sculptural part of the monument would still be human figures. Everybody's really fixated on the figures of coal miners. But to get to those figures, we had to kind of decide, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to, like, represent them? I mean, all these miners are different skin colors and whatnot. So we actually got some of the individuals who had been coming to each one of our meetings to pose for as miners for these monuments. So we had I think this was our 5th or 6th meeting, we had a photo shoot. And there's another one, basically posed people. We had done sketches of what the monuments would look like, and then we posed these individuals that's actually a Winchester rifle that was donated to us that I had not incorporated into an exhibit yet, so I just still had it. So it was a rifle that had been in the Battle of Blair Mountain that we handed to people to hold, and then just got them to do these different poses. And I took all these photos, and then I took the photos into some software and turned them into silhouettes. And then the silhouettes were cut out of core 10 steel here in Pittsburgh at McCamish by union sheet metal workers. And then, so these two people actually were a couple that came to all our clothier meetings, and then that's them as a silhouette in the software, and then that's the initial cutout before the steel had kind of changed color. And then we went down and installed them in these two places. This is Ben Grubb, who's actually a public artist here in Pittsburgh, who did helped us with making sure that these things wouldn't fall over on people, actually, which is not my expertise. Then in the Labor Day of 2022, we unveiled both of these initial sculptures. And so we used the form of the red bandana here to, as the kind of consistent symbol throughout. And then,
hundreds of people came out. It was a very participatory process from the beginning. I think one way in which community development organizations, which I think that's a role that the museum plays, one of the ways they get it wrong is they bring this grand plan and they lay it out in front of people and they're like, hey, what do you think about this? And I think a lot of people are like, well, you planned it out, what else is there to do? And so we literally walked in February of 2022 and said, here's an idea we have, here's our track record, we're gonna be back here each time at the same time every month until we come up with a plan. We're gonna put these up on Labor Day. And some people were like, there's no way. And we were like, yeah, we're gonna do that.
It's fine, we got this.
And tons of people came out. I can remember a lady in an interview saying not only are the miners and their families memorialized through this, but their families are memorialized through this. And so people are going to get to say, hey, that's my mama up there, that's my papa up there, which I think is pretty special. And it goes a long way in building trust with people. And then these people then become mouthpieces for your organization to say, hey, you should really check out what the Miners Museum is doing. It was great to be part of this process.
Yeah, none of these people walked into the first meeting thinking we were going to make them pose for sculptures. But then in the end, this is father and son, union coal miners, daughter and dad, he was a union coal miner, and now they'll be there. A monument's forever, right? It'll be there for thousands of years, right? That's the point. And then that's the monument in Clothier, and those are the people who, for the most part, were in the monument. A couple of them are not, but yeah, so that's they decorated it with flowers for the opening day. And we also had some interpretive panels that are mounted at each site so that people can read about the Battle of Blair Mountain and then also read about the site that they're at, and so the significance of that site to the battle itself. And that's a cake that Maya made for us at the opening. She actually shot the photo for the silhouette that she cut out the night that we finished the sculpture, and then went and printed it out and worked the next day and made the cake. And then, so the monument had already been memorialized as a cake topper within 48 hours of us having finished building it, which I thought was amazing. And this is basically all we have. I threw a couple other things in here. There's some active archaeology going on that we're a part of with a guy named Ethan Carnes, who is a PhD candidate at George Washington University in DC. He's originally from Huntington in West Virginia, And he started doing some work. This is a cartoon I showed you earlier of an incident that happened during the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strikes, and that's the spot where it happened. So this was just in July. I went down there to help him do some initial archaeological surveys to see if these tent colonies, these sites of domestic life during the strikes, may also have some archaeological evidence. So we have a lot of bullets, we have a lot of evidence of battles, we don't have a lot of evidence of the other stuff. So we're moving in that direction now. You can talk about this one.
Yeah, one thing I want to say about the Monuments Project really quick. So that project is called Crows in the Hollers. Name might change. We just got a planning grant through we got a planning grant like a year ago through the National Endowment for the Humanities to think about how do we expand beyond just Moorbat and Clothier. We think that we might build the country's largest labor history trail through this planning grant. That will span over 50 miles. I mean, the Miners' March was 50 miles, but their intended destination was not Blair Mountain. They intended to get to Mingo County. And so we want to map that story out and really use this same process as a way to get people participated in public history and what's represented in their communities. One of the ideas that came out of that project, but also just something we've been talking about at the museum generally, is community archiving. And we just wrapped this up last Thursday. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So we actually went to the counties. So the mining works happen well beyond Mingo County. Our community really spans nationwide, but a lot of the work, localized work, happens in southern West Virginia. And so we worked with our public library system to set up a service for people to bring their items in to get digitized. So one of the goals was yes, we want to be a service to people. Bring your stuff, bring your old photographs. We'll digitize them to you. You can post them on Facebook or email them to your cousin or whatever you want to do. Some people brought stuff, physical objects, and the way in which we set up the rooms when we had this is they would come in and they would be greeted by me at the welcome desk, and I would say, "Where'd you come from? What'd you bring? What do you have?" And it would just be sort of like an intake process. And then I would pass them off to Ethan, the PhD student that is doing archaeology work, and would help them take their things there. And they would sit down with the oral history recorder and talk about stories of the stuff that they brought in. And we've got a wide range of things that people brought in, which I'd love to talk about later. I know we're 15 minutes past time. And then I sent them over to Shaun, where I
scanned hundreds of photos.
He scanned a lot of stuff and also took pictures of a ton of objects. And we're building a living archive of this stuff that's going to be available online. We're also going to mail folks out a USB that has their stories and their stuff that they brought in. And we're going to be publishing a special edition of our museum journal in these hills, which is available to our museum members. So we're going to get a lot into this, I think, in the Q&A, but the museum, we say that we're people-powered, people-funded, people's history. And so over half of our support last year came from individual contributions. So we do compete a lot for grants and grant dollars and foundation dollars. The thing about that is priorities change from year to year. I mean, we saw that during COVID. A lot of people who were funding certain things really shifted, and so we've always been cautious about being too reliant on stuff like that. So that was a huge thing, a huge milestone for us to cross over into last year, to have that people support. One of the things that we have is a membership program. Memberships start at $5 a month. There's no tiers, you don't get anything special if you give $5 versus $50 a month. Instead, it's about give what you can, give what's in your pocketbook and what's in your heart. And we have, I think, about 350 members. That number's probably changed since our last.
I think more at this point.
Yeah. And these are people all across the country. There's people who are members that have never walked foot inside our museum, but they believe in the work that we're doing. And so support it. There's some special perks that come with members. You become a card-carrying member, so you'll actually get a card that we fill out, or our staff fill out, and we'll mail it to you. You also get a subscription to our journal in these hills, which we send out twice a year. And you get a lot of cool perks, which includes like early access to merchandise. We have a gift shop that supports our work as well. And that's it, yeah.
My name's Jackie, I'm the chairperson of our archives and special collections of the Battle of Homestead Foundation, which we have stored at Guardian Storage, and that's our home space. With, of course, the goal and hope someday of having a piece of store. I'm very curious because something struck me earlier on in your presentation, and that was the state, the union bought the building. The union that bought the building, obviously my workers, did they buy the building with the intention of making a museum? That's the first part of my question. What was their reasoning for buying the building and how that moved forward? And how were the salaries paid? Were you totally dependent? Was the staff dependent on grants or other monies? Or was there a more stable stream of financial support to pay salaries in order to build this museum?
Great questions. So, I don't know that we mentioned it, but we just bought the building from the union in October of last year. It's been taking up a lot of energy these days. But, I think that the union did have intentions of the museum moving over there when they bought it. One thing about 1440, so I mentioned it's a retired local union, so no one's actively working, but they are actively working in their community. So they do a lot of charity events where they donate to the library, and they work with, at one point they were going to build a pavilion for the town. They've done special exhibits of their own. They're very interested, I think, in the legacy of that union and of the UMWA at large, and the role that it played, especially in Macon and in Mingo County. Was the second part about salaries?
Yeah, so were you dependent, as this project moved forward, the museum being placed in that building, and then, there had to be some staff. I know there were a lot of volunteers that constructed the museum, but were you dependent on grants for that staff, or how did you form a staff to get this project completed?
That's a great question too. I'll say it's a mix. So I was, the first person that was ever hired at the museum was somebody who was, I think the term was program fellow, and their job, open the doors, let people in. I don't think we were charging admission. We charge a very modest admission now, $5. No one ever gets turned away, but it's less than a high school football game. So if you can pay it, support local history, please do, it helps us. And that was paid through, I think we got a grant that first year, and then once donations started rolling through and we looked at the budget for the next year, then okay, we can afford to keep this person on, and we pay them through admissions. My position started as a grant-funded position through the NEH, and it was just part-time. I'll tell you, I was working a lot more than part-time. But from that, the museum grew. I got to really focus on memberships. I worked a lot with the board. I'll say our board of directors, I really think for the first 5 years of the museum, they were part-time staff. They were the ones planning the events. They were writing the grants. They were pulling up the drywall. They were painting walls with Shaun. And for many years, Shaun was the contractor for the museum. He's been here for 10 years, and it took us a long time to figure out how we raise enough money to support a salary, and we did. In terms of the museum's internal structure, we have now 5 workers that work at the museum. Us two, we have a full-time education coordinator, we have a full-time museum and communications manager, We just hired a part-time museum associate to help us expand our hours. And we also have a part-time AmeriCorps member, so equivalent 5 full-time staff members. And I think it's a balance of the budget to figure out, how salaries get paid. Some of it is incorporated into grants, and then some of it's earmarked for specific donations that come through, or memberships. Sometimes we get unions that give us donations, so it just depends on what the numbers look like from year to year. Becca?
Clarify, as you were saying about getting the, moving it because the union on the building, but the union isn't bankrolling the museum.
No, the union isn't bankrolling the museum. No, they have given us donations, but the museum paid rent for that building. We still pay a mortgage. We actually have something called a land contract where we were able to avoid a ton of bank fees because the union, even though they're not bankrolling us, they still give us a lot of deals, I think.
Yeah. I see there's 2 questions, but I want to add to something you said. I think our board, in my experience with some of the other kind of activist groups that I've been involved with over the years, I feel like our board operated more like a collective for a really long time than a traditional 501c3 board tends to. I actually was not aware of the idea of making some of the decision-making structure that's more classic to nonprofit boards, just because that's not how we did it. I wouldn't say that we were fixated on being a non-hierarchical, consensus-based group necessarily. That's just how it boiled down, because people were just really, really invested in making sure this thing happened. You had your hand up, and Karen had her hand up. You could pick which.
I think you had it.
Yeah, for your community archive days, were there parameters that you set for the pictures that they brought in, the artifacts?
Yeah, we couldn't do CDs or home movies and things like that, and we put that on the flyer. We also said, we didn't say this had to be related to the mine wars or related to coal or unions or whatever, but instead it was a massive call out, and we didn't know what was going to walk through the doors. There is not any RSVP process other than a Facebook event, and so we just hoped and prayed to God that people would walk through the door, and they did. And I think a lot of that speaks to the museum's relationships that we've built over time.
You also did a really good job of letting people know we're not asking you to bring this stuff and donate it. We just want to know what's out there.
Yeah, it's not a gift.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Karen?
Yeah, I don't have a question so much as I want to say on record. I've worked with nonprofits for 30 plus years. This is a model. I've never seen such a model. Many people get together with, a good heart and desire and vision, and it doesn't happen. These folks, we saw what they did with the actual building. That alone, Diane, for any of you who have Jewish background, that would have been enough. But what they did was that history was not just ignored, from what I learned, it was suppressed for decades by the state and by the coal companies. And these folks found a way to dig it up, to present it, to make it interesting and intriguing, and then you sort of glossed over it because they knew it so much, but the Battle of Blair Mountain Centennial was a friggin' celebration. The entire state became aware of the Battle of Blair Mountain and the work and the struggles of the miners because of this group. And it's awesome. I just wanted to make sure that was an explanation on these folks.
And the New York Times did an article about it. The New York Times reported on your centennial and made it national news again. You were national news again. Yeah.
It only took 100 years.
Yeah, somebody said when we finished, I'm trying to think, it was our last meeting about the monuments, but we hadn't actually installed them yet. And I think you were like, okay, we were in Marmette. What did everyone like about this process? And because Kenzie likes to close out meetings with activities. And what did everybody like about this process? And I don't remember what anyone said. Then you were like, would anyone not like something about this process? And one guy was like, I don't like that it took 100 years for this to happen.
Yeah.
Write that one down.
That's great. Awesome.
John.
Yeah, I wanted to echo that sentiment. As someone who works for Rivers of Seal, the station of this building is involved in community outreach work and lessons around town. Really impressive. And especially with how well you were able to collaborate with folks. I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about who was that board that started this organization? What was the group that brought this museum about initially? How did they know each other?
Okay. The question was, who was the original board? And I would say a lot of the board actually came out of the anti-mountaintop removal movement, but from various factions of it. So we had, I was never on the board, but I was an artist. We had a retired art teacher. We had a couple people from the Union Local. We had Lou Martin, who's a teacher at Chatham University. Chuck Keeney, who teaches at Southern. I'm trying to think, we had a couple, it was like a little bit of everything. A couple academics, some activists, some teachers. Who else? I'm trying to think.
Terry and Wilma.
Terry and Wilma, yeah, retired coal miners. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to add to that, if you're really interested, Chuck Keeney wrote a book about the information about the process of
The Road to Blair Mountain, it's called, yeah.
the museum. And he talks about that family history, was his grandfather's, great-grandfather was the leader. But
What's the name again?
it's Chuck Keeney.
Chuck Keeney, and the book's called The Road to Blair Mountain.
Road to Blair Mountain, which is on sale at the museum.
Yeah, we sell that book too.
At our next shop, we ship internationally.
But it's the best part of it, I thought, it was a really fascinating discussion of the politics of putting together an organization like this. And coming from the environmental aspect, the mountaintop mining, where you had a lot of people that felt very strongly and weren't easily dissuaded from their specific point of views. But when it came to putting this museum together, they very carefully chose people that were willing to put aside whatever little differences they had and said, this is what we want to focus on, we're going to make this happen. And it was just a very, group that really worked well together. And, of course, it's Chuck's point of view. I'm not sure that everybody that was involved.
No, most of what you said is true, Chris. That's a better characterization than I could have, yeah.
I thought it was just so fascinating the way you described exactly what you guys are interested in.
So, George, you're going to wrap up so that if anybody wants to stay for talk more
After
with
party.
our presenters, they can, and there are cookies and water available. But my goodness, how phenomenal was this presentation? And thank you for
Just a little show and tell for people of what's back at the table there. Here's a little pamphlet about our idea for the Center for the History and Future of Work. And it's put together, answers a lot of questions that people ask. So take it and read it and think about it if you can. The Pennsylvania Labor History Journal, we have the editor here, Howard Scott. There's always wonderful articles about the BATTLE of Homestead Foundation as well. And if you're interested in the BATTLE Homestead Foundation, you can join. And there are membership forms to do so. The dues are $20 to $40, depending on your employment status per year. And if you just wish to get our weekly email blasts, you can do that by giving us your email, and you can go to our website to do that. You can get that information here as well. thank you so much for coming, Shaun and Kenzie. Thank you for being here. Shaun is a wonderful curator and artist, and helped us. We had a project when COVID started, and the manager of the waterfront shopping mall here offered us a building for the summer. It happened to have been the, what was the lingerie? Victoria's Secret was closing down. And he offered us a bill, they offered to pay for the renovation of it, to have a temporary 3 months that we could do whatever.
Why didn't we do it?
We couldn't raise $30,000. That was our problem. And it's too bad, but there's a lot of opportunities as well. And the thing is, we contracted with Shaun to do the design of what we might show there, and it was going to be a focus on what we call the destruction of the ward. The mill wasn't always the only thing here on this property. There was a ward of Homestead right in the middle of the mill. The mill was on either side. But prior to World War II, when much more capacity was needed, there was a big development process that essentially tore down all the existing houses and businesses and so on. And it's quite a story. We have wonderful historians here talking about and pictures of that story. So thank you very much. Let's continue to collaborate and work together, and let's try to build the People's History Movement and the labor movement together. It's going to be essential, in this next period. We know that the electoral situation is crucial and vital. And if we're somehow successful in maintaining our democracy and building upon the ideas that would assist the labor movement in building the middle class in our country, that's where our work in labor education, labor history, and people's history can help to build that new economy. And that's our next 5 or 6 months are crucial in all of that. And we also are looking forward to our film that might be our main one, and that is the actor Mark Rylance has written a play called Steel. He has involved Steven Spielberg to be the producer of, and it's going to be a television series, and likely towards the middle and the end of next year, there will be a television series called Steel. It's going to be all about the Battle of Homestead and its aftermath. And it starts out with the flood of Johnstown, which was essentially the creation of all the wealthy industrialists in their retreat in Johnstown.
Hey, John.
Yes, Charlie.
I just want to say about Shaun that we first got to know him when he did the bunch of anarchists put up a whole bunch of signs for the 1877 railroad strike that looked just like state historical markers, and they put them all over the area where the strike took place. Much longer and more deep. We put up, I wrote the one for the official Pennsylvania one, but they came and did a wonderful presentation on what they were trying to tell the broader story in more depth. I don't know, 10 or 12 or some.
There were 10 of them.
Andy Basich had apoplectic fit on the whole thing. Yeah, it was absolutely wonderful. They had a truck. They all wore vests and hard hats, and the police were stopping the traffic so that they could put these illegal signs up about the 1877 railroad strike. So that's how we met Shaun.